The War of Resilience imagined a world where listening to the wrong radio frequency could mean execution, where a casual conversation in a coffee shop might send your family to labor camps, where the simple act of keeping a national flag hidden under your floorboards was a profound political statement. This was life under occupation during the Second World War. We talk a lot about armies and invasions. We talk about battles fought by uniformed soldiers. But the real war, the one that determined the spirit of a generation, was fought in kitchens, attics, forests, and city sewers. It was the War of Resilience. How do people maintain hope when overwhelming power crushes every aspect of daily life? How do they build effective resistance movements when the penalty for failure is not just death, but the death of everyone they know? Think about the numbers. In France alone, tens of thousands of people risked everything just to print illegal newspapers. In the mountains of Yugoslavia, hundreds of thousands of citizen soldiers fought for years without external supply lines. In Denmark, an entire nation decided, almost overnight, to save thousands of their neighbors from certain capture by using fishing boats. These acts were not organized by generals. They were started by students, teachers, farmers, priests, and factory workers. They were ordinary people who simply refused to accept that freedom was gone forever. Resistance was not a single unified thing. It was a million tiny calculated risks. It was sabotage, espionage, rescue, and cultural preservation. It was fighting to remember who you were when the enemy demanded you forget. We think of resistance as guns and dynamite. It was that, yes, but it was also a mother teaching her child the true history of their country in whispers. It was a librarian hiding banned books. It was a train conductor deliberately running late. This resilience cost lives. It cost futures. But it ensured that when the fighting finally stopped, the soul of the occupied nations was not broken. It was hardened. These are 16 stories of people who fought back using wits, courage, and sheer stubbornness. They show us that resilience is not a grand strategy. It is the persistent choice to say no, even when the answer seems predetermined. Number 16, does the power of the pen outlast the power of the gun? The regime that occupied Europe believed completely in the power of centralized control over information. They seized radio stations, censored all print, and demanded that schools teach only their approved history. They wanted to erase national identity and replace it with their own doctrine. This is why the illegal press became perhaps the single most important tool of resistance across the continent, especially in places like the Netherlands and Poland. Consider the network known as WWII, the Truth Day, in the Netherlands. This was not a slick operation run by professional journalists. It started small, with handwritten sheets passed between friends in 1940. As the occupation tightened, these small efforts merged into substantial, highly dangerous operations. Printing newspapers required paper, ink, and electricity, all heavily rationed and monitored. It required secret printing presses, often hidden under floorboards in suburban homes or disguised as legitimate businesses. The logistics were terrifying. If a single person was caught delivering a stack of papers, the security police would raid the entire block. They knew these papers, these little sheets of news, were pure poison to their control. By 1944, WWII and other papers like Trial Loyalty were printing tens of thousands of copies every week. They provided factual war updates, exposed the collaborationist government's lies, and offered messages of hope and specific instructions for civil disobedience. They kept the national spirit alive. Historian Lo de Jong documented extensively how these illegal newspapers functioned as the backbone of the moral opposition, cementing the idea that the occupation was temporary. One remarkable example of the ingenuity required was the paper supply. Resistance members would often bribe workers in government paper mills or simply steal huge bales right out of supply depots under the noses of the armed guards. They developed specialized, fast-drying inks that reduced the time needed for printing, minimizing the risk of a raid. This wasn't just news, it was a psychological lifeline. People waited eagerly for these illegal sheets, knowing that reading them was an act of profound defiance. It connected them to the outside world, telling them that the Allied forces were still fighting and that their struggle was not invisible. In Poland, the underground press was perhaps the largest in all of occupied Europe, producing thousands of publications, books, and even academic papers, same all in secret. This work was a powerful form of cultural resistance, ensuring that Polish identity and intellectual life did not simply vanish under the regime's iron fist. The ability of the underground state to govern and communicate through print proved that the legal government, even if exiled, still held the moral authority. This effort was constant, daily, and often anonymous. Most of the people involved in typesetting, printing, and distribution never sought recognition. Many were young women, posing as normal students or housewives, carrying stacks of papers hidden in shopping bags or under baskets of laundry. Their courage was mundane and extraordinary at the same time. They understood that the war was not just about territory. It was about narrative control. The occupying forces devoted huge resources to hunting down these printing operations. When they succeeded, the consequences were brutal. Printers were shot on the spot. Distributors were deported. Yet for every press they destroyed, two more seemed to spring up. The message could be suppressed for a moment, but it could never truly be killed. The printing press proved more adaptable than the centralized censorship apparatus. What happens to the historical memory of those who died simply moving paper? If the printed truth sustained a generation, how much truth is currently being censored that we do not even realize? When the war ended, how quickly did the official safe histories erase the dangerous, illegal truths of the occupation? Number 15 was the Vercors Plateau, a victory or a warning. In France's geography, with its large areas of rugged, unpopulated terrain, allowed for the development of the Maquis, the armed rural resistance. The name comes from the dense, scrub brush common in the Mediterranean region, and it meant taking to the bushes, hiding, and fighting back. The Vercors Plateau, a massive isolated limestone massif in the French Alps, became one of the most famous and tragic symbols of this rural fight. In 1944, as the Allied invasion of Normandy was underway, the resistance leadership decided to declare the Vercors a free republic. This was a massive gamble. The idea was to create a stronghold, an unassailable bastion that would draw away enemy troops and serve as a potential landing zone for Allied reinforcements and supplies. It was a psychological move as much as a military one, showing the world that France was actively liberating itself. The Vercors resistance fighters, numbering around 4,000 men and women, were a mix of former soldiers, urban resistance agents, and local villagers. They were poorly equipped, often relying on outdated hunting rifles and whatever weapons they could capture or receive via risky nighttime airdrops. Their leader, Colonel Huet, known as Hervieux, understood the danger but believed in the potential impact of the stand. They managed to defend the plateau for several weeks, successfully repelling smaller scouting forces and disrupting enemy logistics in the Rhone Valley below. This declaration of a sovereign territory deeply embarrassed the occupying power and its collaborating government in Vichy. It was a direct challenge to their claim of total control. However, the hopes for massive Allied air support never materialized fully. The Vercors was too far inland, and operational priorities shifted. When the occupying regime decided to crush the rebellion, they did so with overwhelming force and brutality. In late July 1944, specialized German mountain and security troops launched a massive, coordinated assault. They used gliders to land silently directly on the plateau's few usable landing strips, a shocking tactical surprise. They attacked from all sides simultaneously. The defenders, spread thin and outgunned, were quickly overwhelmed. The fighting was fierce, but short-lived. The subsequent repression was horrific. Villages like Vassio and Vercors were almost completely destroyed as a warning. Civilians, including women and children, were executed. The toll on the resistance fighters was devastating. Hundreds died fighting, and many more were captured and executed or deported. The Vercors operation remains highly debated by historians. Was it a necessary sacrifice to tie down enemy divisions? Yes, it did disrupt their forces. Was it a tactical disaster that cost too many lives for too little gain? Many argue that the declaration of the Free Republic made them an irresistible target, inviting catastrophe. Historian Peter Lieb noted that the ferocity of the counterinsurgency operations on Vercors showed the extent to which the occupying forces feared these territorial resistance movements. They recognized that if one plateau could declare independence, others would follow, and their control would crumble. What is the line between inspiring sacrifice and reckless waste of life? If the goal was psychological warfare, did the massacre achieve the opposite effect, instilling terror? Did the Allied forces betray the Vercors by failing to deliver sufficient aid, or were the resistance fighters simply asking for more than the Allies could logistically provide? Number 14, what does a nation risk to save its neighbors? The story of the Danish resistance is unique because its primary focus shifted in one pivotal moment from traditional sabotage to a massive, successful humanitarian rescue operation. In the autumn of 1943, the occupation authorities, having tolerated Denmark's semi-autonomous status for 3 years, decided to implement the systematic roundup and removal of the nation's Jewish population. The date was set for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, when families would be at home. However, a German shipping official named George Ferdinand Duckwitz, who was horrified by the plan and had connections within the occupying administration, leaked the details to Danish politicians and religious leaders just days before the operation was to begin. What happened next was an unprecedented nationwide mobilization of civilian courage. The Danes had only 48 hours to act. The message spread with astonishing speed. Priests announced it in services. Doctors called their patients. Fishermen prepared their boats. The entire civil society turned into a massive decentralized rescue network. People hid their neighbors in hospitals, churches, schools, and private homes. The Jewish community was moved from Copenhagen and the larger cities to the coast. And doctors issued false papers and concocted stories to explain the sudden influx of sick patients needing transportation. The resistance groups provided security, moving people under cover of darkness. The immediate goal was to transport approximately 7,200 people across the Öresund Strait to neutral Sweden. The route was fraught with peril. The waters were heavily patrolled by German vessels. The boats used were small fishing trawlers, rowboats, and whatever was available. The financial risk was enormous. The resistance and the civilians had to raise huge sums quickly to pay the fishermen who were risking their livelihoods and their lives. The cost of passage varied wildly, sometimes inflating dramatically due to the risk, but the funds were always found. In one famous account, a group of resistance fighters commandeered a German patrol boat itself, using it to ferry hundreds of people across, before sinking it upon return to avoid discovery. Professor Linne Yahil's study on the rescue emphasizes that the success was due to the almost total refusal of the Danish population to cooperate with the occupying forces on this issue. There were virtually no informers. When the security police went door to door, they were met with silence, confusion, or deliberate misinformation. Within 3 weeks, over 7,200 Jewish people and nearly 700 of their non-Jewish relatives had been smuggled into Sweden, which had guaranteed them safe passage. The number captured by the occupation forces was fewer than 500, a stunningly low figure compared to every other occupied territory. This was not a military victory, it was a moral triumph achieved by hundreds of small coordinated acts of humanity. The nation chose to prioritize human life over compliance, regardless of the consequences. If an entire nation can mobilize in 48 hours to perform an act of massive civil disobedience, what does that say about the true limits of state power? If moral consensus is strong enough, can government cruelty be entirely circumvented? When faced with extreme moral demands, what enables some populations to resist collectively while others collapse into fear and fragmentation? Number 13, can a guerrilla force truly liberate itself? In Yugoslavia, the resistance movement was unique because it evolved beyond sabotage and espionage into a massive organized army fighting a sustained civil war alongside the fight against the occupying powers. This was the largest and most consistently active resistance force in occupied Europe. Led by Josip Broz Tito, the partisans, formerly the National Liberation Army, or NOV, quickly became the primary opposition force after the invasion in 1941. They were based in the rugged mountains and forests, areas that were impossible for the mechanized occupying forces to control effectively. The key to the partisan success was their self-sufficiency and their political ideology, which appealed across the diverse ethnic groups of Yugoslavia, positioning them as the legitimate future government. They were not waiting for the Allies, they were fighting to liberate themselves. The partisans endured 7 major offensives launched by the occupying regime and their local collaborationist allies. These campaigns were brutal, designed to completely eradicate the movement. The partisans suffered enormous casualties, often fighting encirclement in battles like the Suceska in 1943, where they broke through enemy lines even while protecting thousands of wounded civilians and fellow fighters. The sheer scale of their operation was staggering. By 1944, the NOV numbered over 650,000 fighters. They controlled large liberated territories where they established hospitals, schools, and their own governing councils, the foundation of the post-war state. Their methods involved continuous, aggressive guerrilla warfare ambushes, railway sabotage, bridge destruction, and relentless attacks on isolated garrisons. They tied down hundreds of thousands of enemy troops, diverting them from critical fronts in the east and west. Military historian Basil Davidson, who fought alongside the partisans, described their discipline and political commitment as the engine of their survival. The cost was immense. Yugoslavia suffered proportionally higher losses than almost any other European country, estimated at over 1.7 million people, including both military and civilian deaths. But by the end of 1944, Tito's forces were able to liberate Belgrade without significant intervention from the main Allied armies, a source of immense national pride and political power after the war. The experience created a deep, painful rift, however, as the fight against the occupation became tangled up with bitter internal conflicts between the partisans and rival nationalist resistance groups, like the Chetniks, making it a complex war within a war. The partisans demonstrated that a determined, ideologically committed, and massive resistance movement, willing to endure unimaginable hardship, could transition from guerrilla tactics to conventional warfare and achieve self-liberation. This was a blueprint for many subsequent anti-colonial movements worldwide. How does a resistance movement maintain democratic ideals when it must rely on ruthless discipline to survive continuous assaults? Did the brutality required to fight such a long and isolated war poison the political ideals the partisans claimed to uphold? If self-liberation requires such immense internal sacrifice, is external military aid ultimately a corrupting force? Number 12. How does moral clarity stand against totalitarian force? The resistance was not confined to occupied territories. Within the very heartland of the controlling regime, small, brave groups risked everything simply to speak the truth. The White Rose was one such group, founded primarily by students at the University of Munich, including Hans and Sophie Scholl and Christoph Probst. They were not soldiers, they were intellectuals. They recognized early on the profound moral corruption of the government and the systemic destruction it was enacting. Their resistance took the form of clandestine printing and distribution of leaflets. Starting in 1942, the White Rose published 6 different tracts. These pamphlets were masterpieces of moral philosophy and stinging indictment. They did not advocate for violent uprising, they called for passive resistance, civil disobedience, and a moral awakening among the German populace. They used high-minded language, quoting figures like Goethe and Schiller, appealing to the forgotten cultural and ethical traditions of the nation. Their message was radical because it forced readers to confront their own complicity and fear. Leaflet I concluded with the powerful question, if the German youth do not rise up and take revenge, who will? The Skolls and their allies were meticulous and terrifyingly bold. They typed the stencils, procured paper and stamps via black market deals, and mailed the leaflets anonymously across southern Germany. They knew that possessing a single leaflet was an act of high treason. Their most famous and final act occurred in February 1943. Hans and Sophie Scholl brought hundreds of copies of the 6th leaflet to the University of Munich. They placed stacks outside lecture halls. In a moment of high drama, Sophie climbed to the top floor and scattered the remaining leaflets over the central atrium, letting them drift down into the courtyard below. The janitor, loyal to the regime, spotted them. The resulting arrest and swift, public show trial were intended to terrify any potential imitators. Within days, Hans, Sophie, and Probst were executed. Their courage in the face of absolute power became an immediate underground legend. The power of the White Rose lay in its simple moral conviction. They proved that resistance was possible even in the most secure location. They showed that true loyalty belonged to humanity, not to the state. The immediate response of the regime's swift execution only emphasized how deeply threatened they felt by a few thousand words printed on cheap paper. Historians have noted that while the White Rose did not spark mass revolt, their example provided a crucial moral anchor for post-war German reconstruction, proving that not everyone had been silent. Their actions demonstrated that intellectual resistance, founded on clear moral principles, can endure long after the immediate oppressors are gone. If nonviolent resistance is met with instant execution, how does one justify the moral efficacy of such methods? Do these sacrifices serve the living, or do they only offer future generations a comforting, clean narrative? Why did the state fear the simple mailing of a pamphlet more than it feared the physical loss of a small battle? For number 11, when is sabotage worth the risk of mass execution? One of the most spectacular acts of physical sabotage during the war was Operation Gunnerside, the destruction of the heavy water plant at Rjukan, Norway. This mission was not about morale or intelligence. It was about stopping a fundamental scientific project critical to the controlling regime's long-term military goals. Heavy water deuterium oxide was essential for certain experimental nuclear reactor designs. The only facility in occupied Europe capable of producing heavy water in industrial quantities was the Norsk hydro plant, high up in the remote Norwegian mountains. The challenge of attacking this plant was enormous. It was situated on a sheer cliff face, guarded by the occupation forces, and the entire area was snowbound and hostile. Furthermore, the objective was not to destroy the building itself, but a very specific piece of chemical equipment because the high concentration chambers arm, which had to be done without triggering an explosion that would kill the Norwegian civilian workers. Initial attempts failed disastrously. The first mission, Operation Freshman, involved British glider troops, which crashed due to weather. The surviving commandos were captured and executed, violating all norms of war. The second attempt, Operation Gunnerside, launched in early 1943, involved 6 Norwegian commandos trained in Britain. They were parachuted onto the desolate Hardangervidda Plateau, linked up with a small advance team, and faced a brutally difficult 10-day trek across the frozen wilderness. Their approach was brilliant. Instead of attacking the heavily guarded bridge and main gates, they descended into the deep ravine, crossed the frozen river, and scaled the cliff, reaching the plant from the seemingly impossible blindside. They managed to enter the plant through a cable tunnel, avoiding all main guards. Inside, the lead commando, Joachim Ronneberg, placed the explosives on the heavy water chambers. They used long fuses to give themselves time to escape and to ensure the Norwegian staff were safe before the explosion. The mission was a complete success. The facility was severely damaged, and 900 kilograms of heavy water were destroyed. The commandos then executed an almost unbelievable escape, skiing hundreds of miles across the plateau to neutral Sweden, pursued by thousands of enemy troops. This act of resistance bought crucial time, forcing the controlling power to delay and relocate their attempts to restart heavy water production. The impact was strategic and global, altering the course of the atomic race. The story highlights the incredible fortitude of the Norwegian resistance, who operated in harsh, unforgiving environments and faced the constant threat of reprisals. Their calculated risk, however, was immense, as the occupying forces regularly executed dozens of captured Norwegians for every act of successful sabotage. When is a strategic success worth risking dozens of civilian lives in retribution? How do military planners weigh the global impact of a mission against the local, immediate horror it might cause? If the primary goal of the occupying force was deterrence through terror, how did these spectacular acts of defiance continue to inspire rather than paralyze the population? Number 10. How did kitchen tables become the centers of global intelligence? The Netherlands was a key geographical location for intelligence gathering. It sat right on the North Sea coast and bordered the industrial heartland of Germany. This location made the Dutch resistance highly effective in running complex espionage networks, often focused on gathering crucial military intelligence regarding troop movements, fortifications, and industrial production. One of the most remarkable Dutch networks was the Fiat Garage Group, later part of the larger Ordedienst Order Service, and specialized intelligence rings. These groups were initially formed by former military officers who used their pre-war contacts to create communication lines to the exiled government in London. The work was painstaking and required immense technological risk. Sending a single radio message, or WT traffic, was the most dangerous activity a resistance member could undertake. The occupying forces possessed sophisticated radio direction finding equipment, the pale station which could pinpoint a transmitter's location within minutes. Operators had to be fast, move constantly, and accept that their life expectancy was measured in months, sometimes weeks. These networks provided invaluable information. They mapped the locations of coastal defense fortifications known collectively as the Atlantic Wall, detailing gun emplacements, bunker layouts, and troop strength. This information was vital for planning the eventual Allied invasion. They also provided detailed intelligence on the development and deployment of V-weapons, the regime's early missile program, helping the Allies bomb the launch sites effectively. The network known as the T-Force in The Hague, for example, specialized in monitoring industrial collaboration. They tracked which Dutch companies were forced to produce materials for the occupation and fed this information back, allowing for precision bombing that minimized damage to civilian infrastructure while crippling the enemy's supply chain. The danger of betrayal was constant. The regime frequently infiltrated these networks, leading to mass arrests and the collapse of entire communication chains in what was known as the Englandspiel England game. Hundreds of agents and radio operators were captured and executed or placed in camps. Despite these catastrophic failures, the networks proved resilient. As soon as one was dismantled, another was already forming, using different protocols and codes. The sheer determination of ordinary citizens, pharmacists who provided medical aid, engineers who sabotaged equipment lists, and housewives who ferried secret messages kept the intelligence flowing. And historian A.H. Pape noted that the Dutch intelligence networks, despite their immense losses, ensured that Allied planners never operated blind. The intelligence gathered from small houses in Rotterdam or Amsterdam significantly impacted strategic decisions thousands of miles away. How many crucial strategic decisions were based on the courageous reports of a single, anonymous radio operator? If the cost of maintaining the flow of intelligence was the frequent loss of highly trained agents, did the strategic gain always outweigh the human cost? What does it mean for a country to continue risking lives for intelligence, knowing that betrayal is inherent in the structure of espionage? Number 9. When does resistance mean fighting two enemies at once? The struggle for resilience in Asia, particularly in the Philippines, often meant fighting a complex, three-sided conflict against the invading Japanese forces, against local collaborators, and sometimes even against the post-war intentions of the former colonial powers. The Hukbalahap People's Anti-Japanese Army was one of the most prominent Philippine resistance movements. Formed largely by peasant farmers and agricultural laborers, their name was shortened to the Huks. They were highly effective guerrillas, specializing in ambushes, intelligence gathering, and establishing liberated zones in the central Luzon provinces. The Huks were motivated not just by patriotism, but by a deep desire for social justice and land reform, issues that the colonial government had failed to address. They recognized that the fight against the Japanese occupation was intrinsically linked to the fight against poverty and exploitation by local elites who often collaborated with the invaders. Their success was in their deep connection to the rural population. They were the people's army. Villagers fed them, hid them, and warned them of Japanese patrols. The Huks established their own government and tax systems in areas they controlled, often operating more effectively than the official government. Estimates suggest that the Huks inflicted tens of thousands of casualties on the Japanese forces over 4 years. They kept entire divisions pinned down, unable to be deployed to other Pacific theaters. This local effort was vital to the eventual success of the American forces returning to the Philippines in 1944. However, the Huks faced constant internal tension. While they fought the Japanese, they also frequently clashed with other, often American-supported, guerrilla groups that were primarily interested in restoring the pre-war political order, not in achieving radical land reform. When the American forces returned, the complexity deepened. While some Huk leaders received recognition, many others were viewed with suspicion by U.S. and Filipino authorities because of their strong socialist ties. Instead of being hailed as liberators, many Huk leaders were disarmed, arrested, and even attacked by returning forces who saw them as a future political threat. This struggle highlights a critical aspect of resilience, the definition of freedom. For the peasant fighters, freedom meant not just the expulsion of the foreign invader, but the end of systemic injustice. When one fight ended, another immediately began. Historian Benedict Kerkvliet meticulously documented how the wartime efforts of the Huks were systematically downplayed or ignored in official post-war histories because their vision for the Philippines was deemed politically dangerous by the returning elites. Does a resistance movement truly achieve victory if its sacrifice is ignored and its political goals are immediately suppressed by the new powers? How does a population recover when the brutality of the occupation is swiftly followed by the repression of those who fought hardest for change? If the fight is simultaneously against oppression and exploitation, can the two ever be separated? Number 8. How do mountains define the limits of occupation? Greece, with its rugged terrain, became an epicenter of mountain resistance. After the country fell in 1941, it was divided into spheres of influence, and the entire population quickly faced severe famine, especially during the devastating winter of 1941 to 1942. The two main resistance organizations, the National Liberation Front EAM and its military arm ELAS, became forces of not just military opposition but also genuine social governance. ELAS was largely communist-led, but it attracted a wide spectrum of Greeks who were desperate to fight the occupation and address the country's deep political divisions. The fighters took to the remote, sparsely populated mountains areas known as Lavendia Freedom Lands. They created a liberated zone known as Free Greece, which by 1944 covered almost a third of the country, governing 3 million people. Their military impact was significant. ELAS constantly harassed the occupying forces, ambushing convoys, destroying communications lines, and crucially, engaging in massive sabotage operations. The most famous was the destruction of the Gorgopotamos viaduct in November 1942, an operation conducted jointly with the rival resistance group EDES and British saboteurs. This vital railway bridge was crucial for transporting supplies to North Africa. Its destruction was a major blow to the enemy's strategic logistics. Life in Free Greece was a profound exercise in resilience. The resistance established courts, developed a basic education system, and set up a system of self-taxation to fund their efforts. They learned to survive on meager supplies, often taking food directly from the land. The partisans became masters of the hit and run attack, disappearing into the mountains before the inevitable reprisals could arrive. The occupying forces responded with unparalleled savagery. Villages suspected of harboring resistance members were razed, and civilians were executed in massive numbers. Historians estimate that the brutal anti-guerrilla campaigns contributed to the death of over 300,000 Greeks through starvation and direct violence. The Greek resistance tied up dozens of occupation battalions, preventing their deployment elsewhere. Their actions prove that no army, no matter how sophisticated, can truly control a determined population that has retreated into inaccessible territory. The mountains became their sanctuary and their greatest weapon. However, like Yugoslavia, the Greek resistance movement was internally fractured. The deep ideological divisions between the communist-led EAM Elas and the nationalist forces, IDES, meant that they sometimes spent as much time fighting each other as they did fighting the occupation. This internal conflict tragically laid the groundwork for the devastating civil war that erupted immediately after the liberation. Did the internal political costs of the resistance movement outweigh the benefits of its military successes against the external enemy? When fighting for survival, how do you prevent the military strength gained during the resistance from turning into political tyranny afterward? Can the physical geography of a nation dictate the success and nature of its resistance movements? Number 7, who are the silent warriors that fall from the sky? Poland experienced perhaps the most brutal occupation in Europe, facing the immediate destruction of its intellectual, political, and cultural elite. Because the government was forced into exile in London, maintaining high-level communication and coordination with the resistance state required extraordinary measures. The Sieciociemni, or silent and unseen, were the elite parachutists of the Polish Home Army, trained in the United Kingdom. These were not just commandos, they were officers, engineers, economists, lawyers, and radio operators, often former professionals who volunteered to return to the heart of the occupied country to organize, train, and fight. Their mission was suicide by design. Dropped blind into the hostile territory, they faced immediate capture or death upon landing. If they survived, they were essential agents connecting the underground state to the exiled government, often carrying massive amounts of funds, gold and currency, complex radios, and detailed mission plans. Between 1941 and 1944, 316 Sieciociemni were parachuted into Poland. They received intense and specialized training, including demolitions, covert communications, silent killing, and specialized psychological warfare. They were trained to blend immediately into the civilian population, adopting new identities and severing all past connections. Their contribution was vital to the functioning of the Polish underground state, the largest and most complex clandestine entity in all of occupied Europe. They trained thousands of local resistance fighters, commanded sabotage units, and, critically, maintained the radio link that allowed the Home Army to share vital intelligence such as technical drawings of the regime's V-weapons programs with London. The average lifespan of a radio operator in occupied territory was terribly short, often measured in months. The Sieciociemni, who often fulfilled these roles, faced overwhelming odds. Out of the 316 men dropped, 103 were killed in action or executed, and 9 committed suicide rather than risk revealing information under torture. And Jan Karski, though not formally a Sieciociemni, was another example of this high-risk liaison work. As a courier for the Polish underground, he undertook 2 incredible journeys to London and Washington, carrying direct eyewitness accounts of the mass destruction of the population, a heroic mission to force the outside world to acknowledge the unfolding horror. The Sieciociemni were the silent engine of the Polish resistance's professionalism. Their existence proved that despite the total control exerted by the occupying power, a parallel, functioning, and highly disciplined government could exist entirely underground. Historian Stanislaw Jankowski extensively detailed the impact of the Sieciociemni, noting that their presence transformed the Home Army from a collection of local cells into a unified, disciplined military force capable of planning massive operations like the Warsaw Uprising. How does a society choose which of its brightest minds to send on missions where failure is almost certain death? If the success of a mission depends entirely on secrecy, how does a post-war nation acknowledge the sacrifice of those who must remain unseen? When the fight for physical survival requires constant lies and new identities, how do these silent warriors ever truly return to a normal life? Number 6, what does it take to sustain resistance for 8 years? The war in Asia started years before the conflicts in Europe escalated, and the Chinese resistance to Japanese occupation demonstrated an astonishing level of resilience sustained over a long and brutal period, starting effectively in 1937. The vastness of China and the deeply entrenched nature of the Japanese occupation required a different model of resistance, primarily dominated by deep, sustained guerrilla warfare waged by the communist-led 8th Route Army and the new 4th Army, alongside the nationalist forces. The communist forces, led by figures like Mao Zedong and Zhu De, excelled at mobilizing the rural population. They used tactics known as sparrow warfare, attacking small enemy units, sabotaging lines of communication, and then vanishing into the peasant population. They established base areas, particularly in North China, where they created local governments and instituted land reform, gaining fierce popular support. The Japanese response was horrific. They implemented the 3 alls policy: kill all, burn all, loot all, in areas suspected of harboring guerrillas, particularly in the northern plains. This was designed to separate the guerrillas from their civilian support base through pure terror. Entire villages were destroyed, and the human cost was staggering, estimated in the millions. Despite the brutality, the resistance never broke. The guerrillas became masters of tunnel warfare and night attacks. They tied down hundreds of thousands of Japanese troops, estimated at over 600,000 by 1945, who were constantly engaged in counterinsurgency operations rather than deployment elsewhere. This lengthy resistance was a matter of survival through adaptation. The guerrillas had to grow their own food, manufacture their own weapons, often crude but effective, and maintain political discipline despite years of isolation and famine. A critical, often overlooked aspect of the Chinese resilience was the role of intelligence and infiltration. They successfully integrated agents into collaborating forces and urban centers, providing early warnings of offensives and key logistical details. The sheer duration of the conflict, 8 years, meant that generations grew up knowing only war and resistance. It fundamentally changed the political landscape of China, cementing the Communist Party's claim to power, because they were seen by many as the most effective and dedicated fighters against the foreign invasion. Historian Rana Mitter emphasized that the conflict was characterized by brutal attrition on both sides, but the communist ability to frame the resistance as a battle for fundamental social change gave them the ideological edge needed to sustain the fight over such a long timeline. If a resistance movement depends on popular support, how does it survive a policy of total annihilation directed at its civilian base? Does 8 years of uninterrupted conflict fundamentally warp a nation's post-war trajectory toward militarization and authoritarianism? What is the breaking point for a population facing perpetual terror and starvation? Number 5. How do ordinary citizens create the ultimate escape route? The Allied air war over occupied Europe meant that hundreds of pilots, aircrew, and bombers were shot down every month. These men, if captured, faced certain imprisonment. If they could evade capture, they were highly valuable assets-trained military personnel that the Allies desperately wanted back. The Comet Line Linkomet was an astonishing Belgian and French effort to create an organized underground railroad dedicated solely to getting downed airmen from crash sites across occupied territory to safety, usually via the Pyrenees Mountains and into neutral Spain. The line began almost spontaneously in Belgium in 1941, initiated largely by a 24-year-old Belgian woman named André de Jong, known as Didi. She believed that Allied airmen deserved a chance to escape. It quickly evolved into a complex, highly disciplined organization spanning 3 countries. The process was intricate. A downed airman, often injured and in uniform, would be located by local resistance, given civilian clothes and forged papers, and passed from one safe house to the next. The system relied on hundreds of civilian hosts, doctors, railway workers, priests, farmers, who accepted immense risk. Hiding an Allied airman was an immediate death sentence for the entire household if discovered. The most treacherous part was the final stretch crossing the Pyrenees. Didi herself personally led dozens of airmen over the freezing, rugged mountains on foot, often using smugglers' paths to avoid the heavily patrolled border posts. The Comet Line successfully exfiltrated over 700 Allied airmen during the war. Each successful exfiltration required dozens of people to cooperate, and the communication network spanned hundreds of miles, using coded messages disguised as mundane correspondence. The line operated despite repeated catastrophic breaches. The security forces of the occupying power were obsessed with dismantling these escape routes. Several key members of the Comet Line were captured, tortured, and executed. Didi herself was eventually caught in 1943, but survived the war in various camps. Even after her capture, the line was quickly reconstituted by others, demonstrating the deep commitment of the network. The cost was paid almost entirely by civilians. Belgian and French historians estimate that the network cost around 300 lives among its active members, plus countless others who suffered imprisonment and deportation for simply offering a meal or a bed. The Comet Line exemplified how resilience can manifest as a highly organized, bureaucratic, yet deeply human effort. It was resistance motivated less by military ambition and more by a simple humanitarian imperative, protecting those who risked their lives to fight the occupation. If the success of an underground railroad depends on the absolute trust between strangers, how does that trust survive pervasive fear and betrayal? How do we measure the courage of the housewife who hides a foreign soldier in her attic against the soldier who fights a pitched battle? Does this organized humanitarian resistance prove that fundamental goodness can be structured like a clandestine military operation? Number 4, what happens when the tracks are the target? In the occupied territories of the Soviet Union, the resistance movement was dominated by vast numbers of partisans operating behind the front lines, often supplied by airdrops from the Soviet army. Their focus was almost exclusively military, and their greatest strategic achievement was the systematic destruction of the enemy's transport infrastructure, an effort known as the Rail War. The sheer scale of this sabotage was unmatched. The partisans realized that the occupying forces relied entirely on rail lines to move troops, ammunition, food, and supplies to the Eastern Front. By crippling the railroads, they directly hampered the enemy's ability to wage conventional war. The attacks were relentless. And teams of partisans, often made up of farmers and workers turned guerrillas, would sneak into rail yards or remote sections of track. They used specialized magnetic mines or simple explosives, often manufactured in secret workshops in the forests, to derail trains. They targeted junctions, bridges, and rolling stock. A single night of coordinated attacks could destroy dozens of locomotives and render miles of track unusable. For example, during the massive operation known as Concert in the autumn of 1943, designed to support the Soviet summer offensive, partisan units carried out nearly 10,000 separate explosive demolitions on rail lines across the occupied zones. The consequences were profound. Supplies to the front were delayed, sometimes by weeks. Troops could not be deployed quickly to counter Soviet attacks. The occupying forces were forced to divert vast numbers of personnel, up to 10% of their total Eastern Front strength simply to guarding and repairing the rail lines. Historian John A. Armstrong noted that the partisan movement, particularly the Rail War, was perhaps the single most effective guerrilla action contributing to the collapse of the Eastern Front, turning the vast occupied territory from a supply conduit into a logistics nightmare for the enemy. The price of this success was, again, overwhelming civilian suffering. The occupying forces treated the partisan zones as enemy territory, brutally clearing forests and burning villages to deny the guerrillas sanctuary. The partisans themselves were often ruthless, executing suspected collaborators quickly, ensuring that the local population understood the severe consequences of non-cooperation. The partisans were masters of operating in the deep forests and marshes, living in semi-permanent camps, sustaining themselves through hunting and foraging, and relying on the network of sympathetic locals. Their resistance was a matter of total immersion in the environment. If a military force cannot guarantee the safety of its essential supply lines, does its conventional might become irrelevant? When resistance means living in the wilderness for years, does the line between soldier and civilian permanently blur? How does a government reconcile a strategy of relentless sabotage that saves the front line but guarantees the complete destruction of the local population? Number 3, when do former enemies become resistance allies? The Italian resistance, known as the Resistenza or the Partisan movement, took on a distinct shape after September 1943, when the Italian government signed an armistice with the Allies. This act plunged Italy into civil war as the occupying forces immediately moved to seize control of the entire peninsula, installing a puppet government in the north. Thousands of former soldiers, anti-fascists, and young men avoiding conscription joined the partisan bands in the mountains and hills of central and northern Italy. The resistance was politically diverse, united under the Committee of National Liberation (CLN), which included communists, socialists, Christian Democrats, and liberals. The partisans engaged in fierce, sustained guerrilla warfare. They targeted supply lines, ambushed patrols, and became masters of urban warfare in cities like Milan and Turin. Their operations were vital in tying down dozens of divisions of the occupying forces, units that were desperately needed elsewhere to defend against the Allied advance up the Italian boot. A unique feature of the Italian partisan groups was their rapid political organization. They didn't just fight, they created liberated zones and local governing councils. They often protected industrial centers, such as the factories of Fiat, from the occupying forces' attempts to dismantle and move the machinery to the regime's heartland. The partisans played a crucial role in providing reconnaissance and direct assistance to the Allied forces. They established intelligence networks, guided Allied units through difficult terrain, and secured key bridges and infrastructure ahead of the Allied advance. The final phase of the resistance was the generalized uprising in April 1945, which liberated major northern cities like Milan and Genoa before the Allied forces even arrived. This decisive action ensured that the Italian people played a primary role in their own liberation, fundamentally shaping Italy's transition to a post-war democracy. The human cost was significant. The occupying forces, particularly their specialized security police, carried out brutal massacres in retaliation for partisan activity, such as the horrific Ardeatine Caves massacre in Rome, where over 300 civilians were executed in response to a partisan bomb attack. Historian Claudio Pavoni's work, A Civil War, a historical essay on the morality and reality of the Italian resistance, emphasizes that the experience was deeply traumatic because it was a war of three facets: a patriotic war against the invader, a civil war between Italians' partisans and collaborators, and a class war over the future shape of Italy. This complexity defined the resilience of the Italian people. When does the necessity of resistance blur into the bitterness of civil war? If the enemy commits extreme acts of terror in response to every act of resistance, how does a democratic movement justify the continued risk to the civilian population? Can a nation truly unite after a resistance movement fractures along such deep ideological lines? Number two, how do you fight occupation with culture and language? Resistance wasn't always a matter of bombs and bullets. In many occupied countries, particularly those with strong cultural identities like Czechoslovakia and France, the fight became an intense, subtle battle for the preservation of national language, history, and art. This cultural resilience was vital because the occupying power understood that to truly conquer a people, you must first destroy their identity. In Czechoslovakia, the occupation forces attempted to completely suppress Czech language publications, shut down universities, and control public art and music. They aimed to absorb the Czech people into their own sphere, eradicating the concept of an independent nation. The response was covert cultural preservation. Teachers continued to teach forbidden history in secret study groups. Writers circulated poems and essays in manuscript form known as samizdat. The theater, a central pillar of Czech national life, became a key site of defiance. Playwrights and actors used subtle, coded language in approved plays. A seemingly innocuous historical drama could be performed in a way that viewers understood was a direct commentary on the current regime. A line about a historical tyrant would elicit a knowing, profound reaction from the audience, a shared moment of resistance that the censors, who often didn't understand the nuances of the local language or context, could not detect. The preservation of language was paramount. Every refusal to speak the language of the occupier, every effort to ensure children learned their native tongue and history was an act of non-cooperation. This was a long-term strategy aimed at ensuring that even if the physical occupation lasted decades, the national memory would remain intact. In France, the resistance extended to preserving artistic masterpieces. Museum curators and national archivists undertook massive secret operations to move irreplaceable cultural artifacts, paintings, sculptures, documents from city museums to hidden rural chateaux or underground bunkers. This was done to prevent their destruction during fighting or their systematic looting by the occupying regime. The simple act of wearing national colors, singing folk songs, or circulating pre-war literature became powerful symbols. These acts required little physical risk compared to sabotage, but they sustained the moral strength of the population, reminding them that their heritage was superior to the imposed order. Historian H.G. Adler documented how the sheer persistence of intellectual and artistic life, often conducted in prison or concentration camps, provided a deep well of spiritual resilience that kept people from completely surrendering their humanity. If true victory for the occupier is the erasure of identity, how do we measure the success of the resistance that only preserved poems and history books? Can cultural preservation be more dangerous to an oppressive regime than military sabotage? In a time of total information control, how does the preservation of subtle meaning prevent a people from becoming collaborators in their own destruction? Number one, what is the courage of the smallest act? We often remember the grand battles and the famous figures, but resilience during the occupation was mostly comprised of countless small, anonymous, everyday choices made by ordinary people, choices that risked everything for a momentary defiance or a minor act of assistance. This micro-resistance was the foundation upon which all the larger movements were built. It was the train conductor who delayed a vital military shipment by 5 minutes, citing a fake technical difficulty. It was the post office worker who lost the paperwork related to a deportation order. It was the baker who slipped extra bread to the family of a known resistance fighter. In Poland, a notable example was the sheer ubiquity of refusing to use the official currency conversion rates, maintaining the black market as a financial resistance that prevented the occupying regime from fully monetizing the economy. People risked their economic security and their lives daily to simply deal in hidden markets. Consider the risk undertaken by the people who simply listened to the BBC or other Allied radio broadcasts. This was often an immediate capital offense, yet families huddled around small, illegally modified radios, seeking truth amidst the lies. The act of sharing that information, whispering a true update about the Eastern Front to a neighbor home, was a form of intelligence distribution, one sentence at a time. These acts rarely made the history books. They left no trace of explosives or published manifestos, but they collectively created an environment of non-cooperation and moral separation that made total occupation impossible. The authorities could control the roads, the factories, and the media, but they could not control the spirit of millions of individuals choosing minor acts of rebellion. The courage of the smallest act was the refusal of conformity. It was the knowing smile shared between two strangers witnessing an absurdity committed by an occupying official. It was a subtle gesture of solidarity that reinforced the idea that we are separate from them. Historian Robert Gildea's work on resistance emphasized that the true measure of defiance was the successful establishment of a mental and moral boundary between the occupied and the occupier. Every small act reinforced that boundary. This type of resilience demanded perpetual vigilance. It eroded the nerves and created an atmosphere of paranoia, but it kept the flicker of resistance alive for years until the large armies finally returned. If the success of an occupation relies on universal compliance, how effective is the resistance of a million individual minor refusals? Can history ever accurately document the moral heroism of a person who simply chose to look the other way at a crucial moment? If true resistance is a constant mental state, how do we measure the long-term psychological cost of surviving through continuous deception and fear?